Good morning. My name is Mrs. Keehn, and this is my demonstration lesson today. Normally at the start of each class, I would usually be in the doorway. I would be greeting students as they come in, and then I would be giving them a quick direction as to what to do today. One of the major routines that I set up is that typically in the first 5 to 10 minutes, my students are doing a do now. And that's typically something where they are drawing upon an activity from the previous day or doing some sort of anticipatory set. So for today, in a few moments, I will sort of rewind as if we were getting started on the do now, but I wanted to introduce you to a few of the routines and a few of the things that I normally would do in my class. Demonstrated over here, which I would normally announce usually after the do now today, are my classroom expectations and subject expectations. So today's class, we are going to examine the characteristics and criticisms of the US Electoral College. Some of the things that we're going to be able to accomplish include, I can describe how the Electoral College selects the US president, evaluate the pros and cons of the system, and critique efforts to change the system in favor of the popular vote. Friendly reminder that if you have any sort of missing or late work, you know what my deadlines are, and some of the vocabulary can be found on my Quizlet list online, but also ones unique for today are the Electoral College, swing state, and popular vote. That's a lot what we're going to do today. What I'd like to describe to you on the other side of the video is I am today doing a flipped classroom model. Now, I have experience using Schoology, and so what I have taken the liberty to do is post various resources for my students to access. Usually I try to give them at least 2 nights ahead of schedule in order to actually have a little bit of time, because as we know, all students have a very unique schedule, especially high school students. Some of these resources up here are videos, but a lot of them are also readings. Some of the readings, especially from the source of Newsela, can actually have a lexile adjustment, meaning that if any of my students are language learners or low readers, or maybe students who have an IEP where just processing is a little bit delayed, they can actually adjust it to getting the information still for the class, but in a way that it's a little bit more comfortable for their reading level. All right, so on the premise that we are in a do now discussion, I'm going to have my students, based on the fact that I expect that they have already utilized those resources ahead of time, and oh, by the way, if there were any students that because of their iPads they could not take them home, I would have printouts available, and I usually would touch bases on those students who have needs for that. So I just wanted to touch on that. Anyways, first 5 minutes of class. Let's go ahead and discuss with our table groups the following pieces of information on what we had actually gathered together as a class on the Electoral College. Now, normally I would give my students about 5 minutes to turn and talk with their peers. If you note that the level of information here is pretty sort of simplistic, it's very much major descriptors, and that's why usually if we were doing standards-based scoring, it would be kind of at a level 2 that they can identify, they can describe, but they're not really getting into huge depth of learning just yet, but it's just helping them recall. During this time period, it would be absolutely okay for my students to be able to access previous information, to use their resources that they have from online with their iPads just to double check on some of their answers. At the end of the 5 minutes, usually I have music playing or I have a timer going. It's a signal back to the rest of the class. At that time, I would normally call on a few volunteers to help in describing, hey, what is the Electoral College and how does it relate to the president? And I would do a variety of methods, not only volunteers, but a little bit of cold calling. Usually in the time period that they were discussing it, I would try to be meeting with individual tables and just sort of spot checking their comprehension at the time. What is the importance of the numbers 538 and 270? 538, of course, being how many electoral votes are available. And the rule is that each state matches the same amount of electoral votes as there are senators and members of the House. 270 is essentially the magic number in which a candidate gets the majority and therefore wins the presidency. And oh yes, DC gets 3. All right, so moving into the general lesson. Now that we have gone through this, I would also have, because it's a flipped classroom, open it up to any particular questions that students may have. My expectation also was that they come into the classroom with a notebook. So that's where I get that tangible accountability. That yes, they've read the resources, it's probably only about 20 minutes of work, but they've probably taken some Cornell-style notes in their notebook, and if they have any questions, like for example, an anticipated question might be, hey, how are the electors selected? I would try to have that information available, although I would try to put it on the rest of the class to see if anybody else had found the answer. So that way it's more of a group collaborative effort to get the information right. And all the while, students are actually writing information down in their notebooks. All right, so today we're focusing on the Electoral College. Let's take a look for a few minutes at this political cartoon. And I want you to go ahead and turn and talk with your peers at the table. And what do you think that this creator is trying to say about the Electoral College? And why is the creator singling out these states? So let's go ahead and turn and talk. And we'll come together as a class in about 3 minutes. So students will be turning and talking. They will talk about what they notice. Wow, Ohio has a huge amount of emphasis. Colorado, yay, Colorado, woo, we're important. But why isn't a huge state like California or Texas being included? So that's going to be part of the discussions about the nature of swing states. By the way, this is the same political cartoon that was used at an AP Government and Politics exam a few years back, so that's part of the source material that I'm using for this. So once the class comes back together, we're going to point out that hopefully from their readings they have picked up that yes, these are swing states. Well, what makes them swing states? Part of the discussion, either for me to them or them for me, based on their readings that they did at home, is that these states have a population demographic that is pretty evenly divided across the political spectrum. And therefore, candidates spend a lot more time. Therefore, these states seem to be the ones that the media and the candidates are visiting the most. Now, is it fair? That's probably what I'm going to put on the students, that, hey, it's great that Colorado gets noticed, but why are we ignoring California? Why are we ignoring Texas? And that probably leads into conversations about, well, they're so heavily populated in favor of one particular political party that sometimes candidates only show up for fundraising purposes or unless there's something worthwhile at the time. That leads into the next piece of data that we will take a look at the class. And again, looking at the election data below, what do you notice? And for part of this, I did include a few guidelines. That red stands for Republican. Normally I would have the lights a little bit more dimmed in here. Blue is Democrat. Winner of the popular vote has a golden ballot box next to each candidate. The winner of the electoral vote and the presidency has images of the White House and 3 little stars as the design. So go ahead and turn and talk yet again. Let's take about 4 minutes for this one, because I want you to take a little bit of a careful observation. What do you notice about the winners? What do you notice maybe about the vote count? And this might have been really good, drawing upon that election data from the American Presidency Project. So I would give students time, turn and talk. As they're talking with each other, I would work the classroom. I would be checking in, seeing what their findings are. If they're going a little bit off track, I'd probably steer them in the direction saying, well, isn't it weird that if you look at the data there, 1992, nobody won 50% of the vote. So what was going on there? So these are some of those leading questions to sort of really get my students engaged and really thinking a little bit deeper about this topic. We coming together back as a class. Again, cold calling, maybe if there was a group that had a really good piece of information in their discussion that I picked up on, then I would probably call out that group saying, hey, can you share out that one observation that you made? And so hopefully together as a class, we would observe a few things that, well, sometimes the popular vote doesn't always sync up with the electoral vote. And that would be typical in the year 2000, where Bush won the presidency and yet Gore didn't. This might also lead to another conversation in the future about the role of political parties and third parties. Now at this point, if I were teaching about the Electoral College, I probably already talked about political parties ahead of time. And so they would have probably understood the third party spoilers of Ross Perot in 1992 and of Ralph Nader, especially Nader winning 97,000 votes in Florida. And Florida proved to be that swing state tipping point. So these are some of the things that our discussion is going to include. And again, there is this expectation of students that in our discussion, if they're picking up on any sort of interesting pieces of information, they're writing this down. Some of the big criticisms of the college, I know I took the liberty of actually writing it down here, but these were the ones that we really talked about already from taking a look at those pictures, at that swing state political cartoon. That a candidate can win the election, even if they do not win the popular vote. And candidates only have to pay attention usually to a handful of swing states. Electoral votes may not reflect the popular vote within the state. They may not be necessarily representative of the national popular vote in terms of percentage of what they get, not to mention that third-party spoiler effect that could actually swing it into the House of Representatives. Yet this could be another picture that we would take a look at, about one of those critiques of the Electoral College, and that it could still be disproportionate, that you have a lot of but you've got, yes, a lot of electoral votes coming out of California, but maybe Wyoming with 3, proportionally, they still have a little bit more than others. So just kind of skipping through the lesson, I would probably showcase electoral vote versus popular vote by county. Having the students take a look at the popular vote versus electoral vote. This was the 2012 presidential election, so they can kind of see where, especially in places like Nevada, wow, it doesn't really seem that that state would have gone towards blue. But then we start talking about urban areas and how urban areas absolutely will tilt that popular vote. Showing yet another map. This is the map of the vote totals and density of votes. And one thing that I'm going to have my students observe is, of course, how incredibly disparate and usually centered around urban areas was the Clinton vote compared to where President Trump was. Going into yet another political cartoon, I know I'm kind of running low on time, but going into another political cartoon is the reverse argument, and the argument on the national popular vote. What would the vote totals and what would be the importance and prominence of a particular state if we rely just solely on the popular vote? And so, of course, again, talking, allowing the students to have this discussion about what they observe, bringing it back together as a class, doing a combination of volunteers, cold calling, voluntold sort of groups, if I picked up on a really great, thoughtful response for them. And we would start talking about, well, why are these states much more prominent? And a lot of that has to do with population. One note that I've always used with my students, or I should say in statistics for years, is the fact that LA County alone in California has over 9 million people. And that's more than the population of Wyoming, Colorado, and the Dakotas combined. And do the people in LA have the same exact priorities as the people here in Colorado? Maybe not. And so there are some arguments in favor, therefore, of maybe keeping that electoral college. And so some of those arguments that we'd probably go through as a class, part of that discussion and the part of leading on with the notes here, is that, again, why did the framers feel that we needed it in the first place? They were concerned about the education level of the masses. And I'd probably insert a joke about, hey, you guys know that one friend, and that one friend's always coming up with some weird ideas about life and things, and how trustworthy is that one friend to always make the right decision? No. Well, then multiply that by millions, and that might have been what the framers were thinking about when they were choosing this electoral college. It also protected small states, so you have a little bit more of a consensus that is allowed between states, that the little ones, the more rural ones, are still in play. That a state like California, yes, they can have an overwhelming large amount of influence on the popular vote, and yet they're still limited in how much they have a say in choosing that national president. Moving on, as we need to, taking it to the end of class. So, should it stay or should it go? This is where we're getting the level 4 of that depth of knowledge, where we are getting those students where not only did they have an article from the Coloradan about Governor Polis's efforts to have our electors just choose whatever based on the national popular vote, or should we keep it local to Colorado, that it's reflective of just the will of Colorado alone, that these electoral votes should be awarded. And it's something that normally in the last few minutes of class I have my students write a reflection. And it's also, again, in their notebooks. These notebooks at a later time are in fact collected for completion. They do get a score for it. And so it's very self-motivating for those students to get it done. But I do want to open it up to this class, that based on what they have learned, based on what they know, yes or no, what do we do? Where do we go? what do we think should be the way that Colorado should decide these presidential elections moving forward. And so that's the overall content of the lesson. So again, ways that I assess student learning. One, it's going to be eventually taking a look at their notebooks based on conversation, based on their self-motivated flipped classroom, what they took during, they're looking at resources at home. It's, of course, during class time, those constant checks for understanding, checking with the groups, having this discussion over the content, and of course later in perhaps more standardized exams and exams towards the end of the year. Again, this is content that, let's say that I was teaching American government and politics as I had in the past. This is content that is indeed usually on national exams. And so it's vital for these students to know. And ultimately, the big takeaway is that they become really good informed citizens themselves. And so I hope that you have taken the time to sort of see through the lesson. And I hope you've learned a lot, and I hope that you have a decent sense of my style and my planning for this. And I appreciate any additional questions and follow-up when we see each other next week. Thank you very much for your time. All right.